So for much of July, we spent time entertaining the children. For reasons I won't bother to detail, day camp was not in the cards for the first half of our summer, and we found ourselves needing to get out each day and engage in all sorts of explorations and activities. But thankfully for everyone involved, the last 2 weeks they were in camp. And they were in a camp which was a make a musical camp. So kids write their own musicals over the course of 2 weeks. To say that we were shocked by how well our 3 children embraced this endeavor would be a gross understatement. They loved it in a way that I was not anticipating. And I suspect it was because in this camp they were responsible for creating. They weren't just handed a script, they had to create music and lines and sets and everything. They were empowered to make decisions, to create things, to improve on their creations, and then on Friday, they got to perform it, showing off to their loved ones. So there were 2 groups, 2 different short plays, each about 20 minutes. The first, which was not our children's group, but the other group, was about a group of cats and a group of dogs who at first are fighting over a building, and then they agree to share it. And then a group of rats comes by, and the rats get them, trick the cats and dogs into letting them in, and then the rats sow the seeds of mistrust between the cats and the dogs. It's very exciting. And then all of a sudden, there's this anger between the cats and the dogs who had been agreeing. And there was this one line, and I was like, ooh. And it's after the rats had been whispering in the ears of individual cats and dogs, saying, oh, they're trying to get you. And one of the cats stands up and goes, the dogs have turned on us. We have to get them before they get us. No dialogue or diplomacy or asking the dogs if indeed they were now mad, just whispers that become instantly a justification for fighting, right, at all costs. Now, the second show, the one that our children did help create, was the story of an evil scientist, Dr. Einstein Jr., who, in order to keep his child alive, invents AI that takes over half of their child. And then in order to sustain the AI, please don't ask about the science behind this because there isn't any. In order to sustain the AI, the scientist and the half AI, half child have to torture animals, okay? Right. But of course, by the end, the scientist sees the light and realizes he could have saved his child's life by creating technology that wasn't harmful. And he lets the animals go back to their homes and find their loved ones. Now you can imagine that throughout these 2 shows, I was like, Oppenheimer, Oppenheimer, Oppenheimer. I promise I didn't say it out loud. Now I said in my message earlier this week that seeing the movie was not a requirement. Out of sheer curiosity, did people get a chance to or want to? Okay, so some folks. Now, to make sure that I wasn't lying earlier in the week, I'm gonna do a super brief synopsis of the film, okay? And I'm not worried about spoilers this week because it's a biopic of an historical figure, so sorry, too bad, okay? Now, the film was inspired by the biography American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer was born in New York City at the very beginning of the 20th century, and was the physicist who essentially brought theoretical physics from Europe to America. He studied abroad across Europe, learning from and meeting some of the top scientists of the late 1920s, and then he came back to teach at Caltech and Berkeley, and to build physics departments based on this new physics that he was learning, this new science. He was, at the very least in his early years, and perhaps throughout his life, sympathetic to the Communist Party. But in spite of the concern our government had at the time about communist ideology and those who espoused it, Oppenheimer was chosen to help lead the Manhattan Project. Now, the Manhattan Project was the code name for the project to build a nuclear bomb before Hitler and the Nazis could. It was a project that spanned years, took billions, that's with a B, billions of dollars. You can imagine how much that translates to. That was in the 30s, right? Billions of dollars. And the work of the project took place across multiple sites in our nation, each focused on different aspects of the project. It was the site that Oppenheimer built and led that eventually tested the bomb in the deserts of New Mexico at Los Alamos. So the film follows Oppenheimer's story from postgraduate work in England up through the aftermath of his leadership in creating the first atomic bomb. It tracks much of his personal life, attempts to capture his particular genius and hubris and charisma and passion, speaks to the moral quandaries he faced as he participated in the creation of technology that wreaked so much devastation on so many and changed our world forever. The film is long, 3 hours. I found those hours surprisingly quick. I don't know how you felt. The music underscores the tension and the underlying horror. We heard at least one piece, right, from it this morning. The acting was stellar, I thought, across the board. There are what I found to be sort of gorgeous sequences of stars and fire and light that attempt to give visual insight into how Oppenheimer's mind worked and the discoveries that the new physics of the time was making. The use of silence and then explosive noise deepens a viewer's understanding of how light and sound relate. And I will share honestly with you that this type of film is not usually my cup of tea. If I hadn't decided to do this series, we would not have seen it in the theater, I can assure you. But I really did end up feeling that it was worth the time and even the money. Because on top of all of these cinematographic qualities that made it an interesting and engaging film, it raised serious questions and issues about technology, morality, the realities of war, and the complexity of responsibility. Now, I want to be clear up front. I am aware that this sermon can't possibly cover every aspect of this film, okay? So there are questions of intimate relationships and parenting, of addiction and mental health. There are questions about the early 20th century understanding of Hinduism and the influence of the Bhagavad Gita, in particular on theorists of the time. And there's so much more that we're just not even gonna pretend to try to engage with today. So I just wanna say, I really would love to hear, if you have seen the movie or when you do, what aspects stood out to you? What things were most interesting to you? Because I'm gonna talk about the ones that struck me, but I wanna know what you walked out wondering about and thinking about. So please do share that with me in some way. Now, I wanna say, I feel like it would be a mistake if we didn't start with a sort of fundamental issue about the film itself. When we decide to let certain things in, we are making a choice about what we keep out. The director, Christopher Nolan, makes a clear choice to minimally engage with the cost of the Manhattan Project, not the financial cost, which gets mentioned multiple times, nor the moral cost of the bomb's creation, which we will come to, but the human cost of even beginning the project. Before I saw the film, I had read a thread on social media by Elisa Lynn Valdez, who was responding to a New York Times review that describes Oppenheimer as, quote, director of a clandestine weapons lab built in a near desolate stretch of Los Alamos, New Mexico. As Valdez points out in her thread, this area of New Mexico was not, in fact, near desolate and uninhabited. The term that she uses is Hispanos, and she says the Hispanos who lived there were required to leave, given only 24 hours. Their farms and land were razed, bulldozed, their livestock were killed, and they had nowhere to go. Valdez shares that many of the men who were pushed off their land were then rehired to work at the labs, given insufficient protective gear, and then faced health consequences up to and including death from exposure to toxic material. In the film itself, you may remember if you saw it, as Oppenheimer is showing the Los Alamos Mesa to the Army General, Leslie Groves, Groves asks, like, what happens on this mesa? What's here? And Oppenheimer responds with this very throwaway line that the mesa is a burial ground for Native Americans in the area, and that's like it. And then later, when asked what to do with Los Alamos now that the project has finished, Oppenheimer's answer again is just this one line, and this is the quote, "Give it back to the Indians." And that's the entire treatment of the issue in a film whose cast is conspicuously almost entirely white men, with a smattering of white women, maybe 3 of consequence if you stretch. Valdez, at the end of her thread, writes that although she has been trying to get someone to make the movie that tells the story of the people of Los Alamos displaced and dying and eventually filing suits against the government, quote, no, She writes, "We want more films about the complex and troubled heroic white men who conducted their genius in a virtually unpopulated place." And each of those quotes are from the review that she is responding to. And she goes on to say, "These are all lies. This is mythology in service to white supremacy and the military-industrial complex, masquerading as nuanced." I think the critique feels valid, at least to me. And in pursuit of the honesty we seek, I think we need to keep at the forefront of our minds that there are whole stories not being told by this film. It is also the case that the consequences for Japan and its people is given perhaps a slightly deeper treatment, though that remains entirely contextualized within Oppenheimer's internal moral struggles. There was a cost to the Manhattan Project that was unrevealed at the time and that remains too unknown today. And there is also a cost to telling this compelling story in this way, leaving out those other elements. Even if we can view its minor treatment of those other stories as sort of a point in and of itself, there is still a cost. We have a responsibility to remember this even as we enjoy or engage with the film, and we have to commit ourselves to learning more about the stories that remain untold in this retelling. That abdication of responsibility to tell this story could be viewed as pragmatic. The movie is already 3 hours long, but there are infinite ways to use 3 hours, and choices were made. And those who made the choices have to contend with the reality of their choices, what it means and what the fallout might be. And still, I personally find it hard to deny that the story the film does tell of the tortured scientific genius who enters into this project with passion and determination, even as he wonders what it will all mean. This story about the creation of the most devastating group of weapons the world has ever known elevates still relevant questions about technology, the advancements of science, and who is responsible. A reading this morning offers some insight into the relationship between technology and the humans who use it. On a smaller but still deadly scale, the issue of guns is addressed by Bruno Latour as he attempts to break down the notion that guns don't kill people. We like to think of objects as just objects, science as science, morally neutral. The professor of philosophy, Evan Selinger, in an article in The Atlantic on the same topic, names this. It's what philosophers call the instrumentalist conception. That's the idea that technology is neutral and we bring to bear values on it as we employ it in varied ways. That position is speaking to the relationship between technology and user, but it kind of offers an out for the people who create the technology. If my creation is neutral, I'm not responsible for how you choose to use my creation. My creation is just neutral. That's out of my hands, right? Yet the idea that our creations exist in some pure state of neutrality outside of human invention and interaction is kind of tough to swallow. Selinger points out, as did the reading, the object or technology or space that we engage with is designed for particular use, and we know this. When we engage with the object or technology, not only is the object put to use in a certain way, but we become different by our interaction with it. That's the point of that idea about the baseball player, right? Who at home is happy-go-lucky and then steps on the mound with a ball in hand and becomes intense and competitive. Our behavior can change because of our relationship to an object. And it goes beyond objects that we manipulate and use. Selinger writes, for example, quote, "Museums and sites of religious worship can induce more than a momentary inclination towards reflection. They can allow one to view artistic and spiritual matters as a contemplative being." The idea, right, someone who outside is not particularly reflective or contemplative steps in here and has moments of deep reflection that they don't outside because of how this space is created and used. Spaces intentionally created for quiet and contemplation work to elicit that posture and change our typical behavior. Spaces, objects, technology, all of it is created with intention, with purpose in mind, and it results in an impact and can actually work to transform us for good or ill. If no one ever enters the museum or picks up the gun or uses the technology, perhaps we can say it remains neutral. But that's not how the world works. So the scientific advancements that underlay the creation of nuclear weapons could be viewed theoretically as neutral if one adopts the instrumentalist conception. We might even say, if we wanted to be more positive, that harnessing the power to split the atom was a step forward in human innovation that required the uncovering of new understandings about how the universe works, and that some of those have led to positive changes. We could say that this was science for the pursuit of knowledge and comprehension of this world we share. There are moments in the film when this idealized commitment to science is the position taken by those involved. We could argue that the technology has been put to other uses and that validates its existence. Just as a gun, Salinger says, can be used like a frisbee or a hammer, just because it can be used that way, it doesn't mean it's going to be used that way. And it doesn't negate the origin story. That's part of the point here. The Manhattan Project existed specifically for the creation of a weapon of mass destruction that would end World War II and the Nazi march across Europe and the annihilation of the Jewish people and others. The technology was created to enact violence, no matter how noble the desire to end the war, and it will be used that way into the future. Our possession of that kind of power and knowledge and those kinds of objects changes how we behave, how we govern, how we interact. It definitively changed the world forever. At various points throughout the film, Oppenheimer and others acknowledge the moral struggle of the project. When scientists are first being recruited, Oppenheimer's friend and fellow scholar Isidore Rabi initially resists. You may remember this, saying, "You drop a bomb and it falls on the just and the unjust. I don't wish the culmination of 3 centuries of physics to be a weapon of mass destruction." And Oppenheimer convinces him to come aboard with the project with the argument that it is necessary to stop the Nazis. At one point, Oppenheimer acknowledges that he isn't sure if America can be trusted with a weapon of this power, but he's sure that the Nazis can't. The cats and the dogs. At another point, Niels Bohr, the celebrated scientist, has come to Los Alamos after being rescued from Europe. He doesn't intend to stay, but he has come to sort of see what's going on with this project. And he asks Oppenheimer if the bomb will be big enough. When Oppenheimer asks if he means big enough to end the war, Bohr replies, big enough to end all war. Will the bomb, he wonders, be big enough to ensure peace through deterrence? And shortly after that exchange, they have the following exchange, echoing something Bohr had said to Oppenheimer when Oppenheimer was a student traveling through Europe. Niels Bohr in the film says, "The power you are about to reveal will forever outlive the Nazis, and the world is not prepared." And Oppenheimer responds, and this is echoing back something that Bohr had said to him a decade before, "You can't lift the stone without being ready for the snake that's revealed." And Bohr states with deep clarity, we have to make the politicians understand this isn't a new weapon, it is a new world. This new world is underscored in conversations between Oppenheimer and Einstein, and in the way Oppenheimer's work lives beyond him in ways he didn't support or predict when he first became caught in the fervor of the project. Even as so much money and intellect and human power and ingenuity is marshaled for the Manhattan Project, we are given glimpses into moments of uncertainty among the key players. Later in the film, when the bomb has been successfully tested, the film explores the differing opinions of the scientists who helped create it. Some initiate a petition that asks the government not to use it. Others adopt that instrumentalist conception that says they built a thing of neutrality for the purpose of furthering science and it is out of their hands. The film doesn't definitively answer the questions that it raises. This isn't the work of the film, I don't think. We see wrestling, but no final moralizing word on who bears responsibility for the technology we create. Oppenheimer feels it's his, Truman feels it's his. Everyone has a different position. There's no definitive answer to who should be allowed to create the objects we invent in pursuit of science or just war or knowledge. And I think the closest the film comes to taking a moral stand is actually when Oppenheimer's wife, in response to some fallout from Oppenheimer's infidelity, says to him, "You don't get to commit a sin and then have us all feel sorry for you when there are consequences." And yet, even that line is undercut by the film's very sympathetic portrayal of Oppenheimer. The film, I think, resists a definitive stand on the morality of the bomb, but it exposes the sort of capricious and individual nature of decision-making, even on a governmental scale, and the deep risk that comes with assuming we know how another individual or another country will use the tools around them, or how they will respond or act. This is especially evident as those in power discuss their certainty that Japan will never surrender without an unequivocal show of might, and that's why we have to drop a bomb. We are left, actually, with Oppenheimer wondering if perhaps Japan was on the brink of giving in and the use of the bomb was unnecessary. Overall, I think the movie lifts up uncertainty more than it provides certainty. When we invent, we don't know what the success or the outcome will be. When we act with self-assured, self-righteous certainty, we may make an irrevocable wrong move. We don't ever hear Oppenheimer express regret directly. He holds the tension with us, that tension of pride in achievement and also fear of what has been wrought. The film doesn't offer a definitive answer. It abdicates that responsibility, for better or worse, offering instead an exploration of many ideas, opening up avenues of thought and provoking us into offering our own answers. It leaves us asking, was the creation of the bomb the right thing, knowing that across the globe others were working to create it as well? Was it right, knowing the human and moral cost that we know now? Should the inventors have been given control over what they invented? Can we ever know what another intends to do, truly? Is certainty our enemy? Who bears responsibility for the impact of science and technology, and are objects ever actually neutral? What is our relationship to the past, to the future, to our own obsolescence? And I'm gonna kind of abdicate responsibility too and tell you that I'm not gonna answer those questions for us. I'm gonna invite you into them. I'm gonna invite you to engage with them using the film or not using the film. But I will say this. I will say that I believe that each of us has a responsibility to engage in honest, intentional, and thoughtful living, and that involves adopting these values in how we consume, how we create, how we speak, and how we interpret. It means being cautious in our assumptions about another, being assiduous in our search for truth and meaning, being conscious of how we act and interact with others, trying to imagine what the impact will be beyond just our intent. And what I will also say is that my values call me to a life of greater responsibility, greater depth of thought, greater willingness to dwell in the tension and uncertainty, even when it is uncomfortable. And it is uncomfortable to consider how the technology we have built has changed us as a species and how it can change us as individuals. But we have to wrestle with this question because we cannot now escape what we have unleashed. The rock has been upended and the snake beneath revealed, and we are not passive recipients. We are not objects that our own creations act upon without our consent or will. That view, right? That view leaves us powerless and without any responsibility. And I believe that we bear responsibility for ourselves, and we bear responsibility for the victims impacted by our choices, and we cannot put those to the side. We must remember that we have the capacity to choose how we will be changed. We get to choose if we tell the untold stories. We get to choose if we reap the benefits of destructive technology. We get to choose if we are willing to take responsibility. We get to choose if we will bear the consequences of the choices we make. And I'll tell you, Friday's 20-minute musicals reminded me that the children already know this. They understand that these are questions to be wrestled with, thought through creatively, applied to the world around us, and that ultimately we get to influence the outcome. That's what we have to remember. May we remember that we are actors, not bystanders, subjects, not objects, and may we live accordingly. May we always remember our responsibility and never erase the people we owe that responsibility to. And may we never stop wrestling with the difficult questions in all the ways that we know how. So may it be.